In 1973, two social psychologists conducted a really fascinating study on a set of Princeton seminary students training to become priests. Over the course of 3 days, they had each student come in individually, answer a number of surveys, including questions asking them to reflect on their motivation for training to become priests. Then they asked each seminarian to prepare a brief sermon, and then had them head over to a different building where they were to deliver the talk. Here, the students were divided into 3 different groups. One group was told they had plenty of time to spare and would be early if they left right away. A second group was told that they should leave now if they wanted to arrive just on time. A third group was told that they were already running late and they should hurry to get there. Now, the researchers planted a man at one of the doorways that each of these students would have to pass through, and this man was coughing and groaning, clearly in a state of distress. When they passed by, overall, only 40% of the students stopped to help him. In the group that was not in a hurry, 63% stopped to help the man. In the group that was right on time, just 45% stopped to help him. In the group that was told they were already late, just 10% stopped to help him. Now, this is the kicker. The passage that the students were asked to preach a sermon on was the one that your group just read together, the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's right, these were seminary students training to become priests, reflecting on their motivations to do so, and not only had they just read the parable of the Good Samaritan, but they were about to preach a sermon on it, and only 40% of them stopped to serve a person in need. This exposes something uncomfortable. Our problem isn't that we don't know what love looks like, it's that we're often not available to live it. Hurry is a dangerous enemy to our formation into people who are like Jesus. Jesus' ministry was chock full of interruptions, and he responded to them all graciously, moving at the pace of love. Maybe you can relate to those seminary students. Many of us are moving at such breakneck speed, we don't seem to have time to stop and help the dying man on the side of the road. And when we do finally pause to take a break or a holiday, we're too exhausted to be of much help to anybody. We have a 50-hour work week, kids to raise, dinner to cook, appointments, classes, and on top of that, a world of distraction upon distraction vying for our already sparse attention. Maybe we feel like if we slam on the brakes to help the dying man on the side of the road, we'll just get rear-ended by life. Like we discussed in our last session, we need to practice serving in order to become servants. Just knowing the right facts or having a good heart often isn't sufficient to make us people who have hands that move the impulse of God's love. So, we need to adopt practices and habits that will reshape our heads, hearts, and hands to be ready when the opportunities to serve come along. Last week we talked about why we serve, and the answer was love. Because God first loved us, we serve others out of love. In today's session, we're taking another angle. Are our lives actually structured so that we can serve others in love? We're going to look at a key posture that we need to have towards the world and others if we're going to be, like Jesus, not just people who check off the box of a mandatory act of service, but servants to all. That key posture is availability. If we're going to become Jesus-like servants, then we need more than good intentions. We need to cultivate a life that allows us to make ourselves available to serve others. This availability looks both like intentional efforts to create space in our lives, but also simply being interruptible people like Jesus was. How do we get there? How do we become people who imitate Jesus' radical posture of making himself available as a servant to all, and not just when it is easy or convenient? What does this posture of availability actually look like? Let's begin by exploring one of Jesus' most famous teachings, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In a classic gospel story scenario, a religious leader wants to test Jesus, either to trap him in an uncomfortable spot with a divisive question, or just to get a read on who this Jesus guy is and what camp he might fall into. Either way, Jesus, also in classic form, turns the tables on the expert in the scriptures and asks him to answer his own question. This expert lives up to his name because he hits it out of the park. Jesus says, "You have answered correctly." And in fact, we know from Matthew chapter 22 that when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he gave the same answer as this expert did. So this guy obviously knows his stuff, just like our Princeton Seminary students, oftentimes just like us. But there's a tension in this man. His next question is revealing. And who is my neighbor? In the context of Leviticus 19:18, where he had quoted from, it was generally taken that one's neighbor was their fellow Israelite, something this expert in the Torah would surely know. Let's read that verse in the context of the previous verse. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. See how neighbor is twice set up as synonymous to Israelite or your people? This expert in the law is not just asking, who can I love and serve, but rather, who do I have to love, and who can I safely ignore? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now the 17-mile journey between Jericho to Jerusalem was one fraught with danger. Its most frequent commuters, aside from priests and Levites heading up and down from periodic duties at the temple in Jerusalem, were robbers. The many caves, as well as the steep descent and rocky desert terrain, made it a prime area for the kind of activity described here. Violent attacks resulting in robbery. Understandably then, this priest passes by on the other side. First of all, there could be significant danger involved. It could be a trap or a ruse of some kind meant to lure somebody into a vulnerable spot before they become the victim of a robbery. Second of all, as a priest, this man would have had a strict biblical injunction not to make contact with a dead body. Now, the priest doesn't know for sure if this man is dead, but it's better not to risk it because, as Leviticus 21:1 says, a priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean for any of his people who die. If he did, Numbers 19 tells us that the requirement to become ritually clean again was a 7-day cleansing period. As a priest, a state of ritual impurity would have been highly inconvenient, not just to him, but to his fellow priests and the people they were meant to serve. Whatever this particular priest's reasons may have been, he passes by on the other side. He's not available. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, a Levite is more general of a class than a priest, like a second-ranking figure in Jewish religious life. But he still would have had many of the same potential concerns as the priest. The potential danger of robbery, for one, but also touching a dead body would also make him ritually impure for at least 7 days, a significant inconvenience. Just like the priest, the Levite passes by on the other side. He's not available. Now, an interesting thing about these two figures is that, as a priest and a Levite, both would have been experts in the scriptures. So while they would have known Leviticus 21 and the injunction against priests touching dead bodies, as well as Numbers 19 and the requirements for ritual purity for any Israelite who touched a dead body, they would also know what the expert of the law knew, that the greatest commandment was to love God and love neighbor. In fact, a common principle in Jewish interpretation of the law at the time entailed that the preservation of human life overrides almost any other religious consideration. But knowing all of this was not sufficient for the priest and the Levite. They hide behind the letter of the law to avoid allowing themselves to be interrupted, to become available to love and serve their neighbor who is dying on the roadside. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, this is an unexpected twist in Jesus' story. His character progression has gone from the priest, the Israelite who has the highest duty to represent God and mediate his blessing in life and love to another, down to the Levite, a secondary ranking religious figure, to a Samaritan. One might have expected an average, everyday Israelite to be the final figure in this story, but a Samaritan? The Samaritans were the sworn enemies of the Jewish people. Think of the increasingly polarized partisan politics of North America today, and then turn the dial up to 11. The Samaritans had sided with the enemies of the Jews in the Maccabean Wars. The Jews had destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans had retaliated by desecrating Jerusalem's temple with human remains. In John 8:48, the Jews, they're trying to insult Jesus, and they call him demon-possessed. And then the parallel insult they throw on top of that is that he's a Samaritan. Just a chapter earlier in Luke, Jesus' disciples, John and James, wanted to call down fire upon a Samaritan town and destroy it. A Samaritan person is the last that Jesus' audience would be expecting to see here in the story. And yet what happens? The Samaritan is moved by compassion. Jesus says, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. The Greek word translated pity there literally means to have bowels yearn, or to be moved in one's inmost parts. It's a deep, visceral, gut-level compassion that this man feels. But he doesn't stop at feeling compassion. He goes to him. He bandages him. He uses his expensive oil and wine to treat his wounds. He puts him on his own donkey. He brings him to an inn. He takes care of him. He spends a significant amount of money on him. He entrusts him to the care of another. He promises to return and check in and pay for any other expenses that were incurred. In other words, he made himself radically available. He allowed his life to be interrupted. We don't know what this Samaritan man was doing between Jerusalem and Jericho, but whatever it was, he was in enemy territory, and he probably didn't want to stick around any longer than necessary. Yet, he wasn't in too much of a hurry to help his neighbor. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Jesus flips the question. Now it's not who is my neighbor, or in other words, who can I get away with not serving? Instead it becomes, who became a neighbor? So the question for us as we consider Jesus' final words, go and do likewise, isn't who qualifies for my service, but rather, will I become the kind of person who's available to serve whoever God places in front of me? How do you respond when the unplanned and unexpected comes your way? What's your automatic response to life? Is it more like Jesus, or more like the seminary students who were too busy to stop? Is it more like the priest and the Levite, or the Good Samaritan? I suspect that for many of us, our problem isn't that we don't know who to love or how to do it. It's that we're often too busy, too distracted, or too hurried to be available to love them. We become so wrapped up in the tasks of our day-to-day, whether it's work, school, family life, or some other good and worthwhile thing, that we forget our primary task of loving our neighbor. And the harsh truth is that you can't love your neighbor, you can't serve them, if you aren't available to them. That's why the key skill for this session is not about adding more to your life. It's about being more intentional, about making yourself available to the opportunities and even interruptions that God places in the path you're already on. The issue isn't a lack of opportunity. Rather, for most of us, like in the experiment with the seminary students, the issue is a lack of margin and a lack of availability to interruption. Portland-based pastor and author Tyler Staton tells the story of his Uncle Bobby's funeral. Uncle Bobby was a night shift custodian at a hospital in Nashville, and he died tragically young, at age 43, after a battle with leukemia. There was a small gathering to commemorate his life, where he worked, in a rather modest attendance. A few minutes after things began, a few disheveled men, clearly without housing, entered the room. As people swapped stories and memories about Uncle Bobby, one of these men spoke up. He said, every winter night, Bobby brought us blankets on his way to work at the hospital. In the morning, he'd pick them up and have them laundered, and do it all over again the next night. Apparently, Bobby had been doing this for years, and nobody even knew about it. not even his wife. These men lived under an interstate overpass that Bobby drove by every day on the way to his shift. As he got off that exit, he noticed them trying to sleep in the cold. He stopped. He served them. He learned their names. He shared his life, and he became friends with them. Tyler Staton goes on to say that the reason he knows this story is not because he was at the funeral himself, but because his dad, Uncle Bobby's brother, was there. And Tyler's father was transformed by that moment. Why? Because he got off that same exit to go to work every day too. He saw those same men huddled there in the cold in the morning, and he had never stopped. He'd passed them by on the other side of the road, even as a follower of Jesus. Same road, same exit, same men under the overpass. One brother stopped, one didn't. Each of us has lives that are full of opportunities to serve. Service isn't just about filling a volunteer position at the church or lending a helping hand at a soup kitchen downtown. It can be, but it's also the everyday, ordinary opportunities that God presents to us. There's great need for service all around us and the people we cross paths with daily. The question is, are we ready to slow down, to stop, to be interrupted, and make ourselves available? Many of you are likely already serving, intentionally and unintentionally in many ways. You're all part of a small group rhythm now that involves a community service project every 4 weeks. Maybe you're serving our church family in some capacity in a ministry. Maybe you live with your family or a housemate and serve them when you wash the dishes or cook dinner or do laundry. It's likely that your job entails lots of opportunities to serve others, whether it's grabbing a coworker a cup of coffee on the way in or offering a listening ear to a customer who's going through a rough patch. The point is, we likely don't need to go out of our way to add more to our lives in order to have opportunities to serve. In fact, it's probably better if we cut some things out of our lives in order to create more margin in our schedules and energy so that we have a greater capacity to serve, to notice, to be available. This might even mean saying no to some good things, but it's so that we can say yes to the things that matter the most. In John chapter 6, Jesus is followed by a great crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children. The crowds are hungry, and the disciples are wondering how they're all going to be fed. Andrew speaks up and says, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Notice the repeated adjective, small. It's not just 5 loaves and 2 fish, it's 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. But what does Jesus do next? He multiplies it into a feast that feeds everybody there with 12 baskets of leftovers. All this boy had was 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. We don't know much about him. All we know is that he made available what God had given him to the service of others. Will we make what God has given to us, our time, our gifts, our relationships, our experiences, and make them available for his purposes? Will we surrender our 5 loaves and 2 fish into Jesus' hands as we join him in serving others? What kind of person do you want to become? The kind of person who walks past, or the kind of person who stops? The kind of person who's too busy to be interrupted, or the kind of person who is available? In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says, "The great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things as interruptions of one's own or real life. The truth is, of course, that what one calls interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending one day by day." Are you available for the life that God is sending you day by day, moment by moment, interruption by interruption? Like we spoke about last time, we won't just will ourselves into being radically available, interruptible people, but we can adopt practices, intentional habits, and structures that will help us to train into the kind of people who are radically available, the kind of people who stop by the side of the road, who meet the stranger that God interrupts our journey with.